The night over Tarsis Hex broke like glass when the sky split and something small and incandescent fell through the wound, trailing a thread of white fire that stitched across the void shields of the upper hive spires before skipping once, twice, and coming to rest in a crater that hissed with vaporized ferrocrete and rain. Vox traffic spiked to a shriek as sirens woke a city bred to fear cracks in reality more than earthquakes, and Governor Livia Thane stood on her balcony with magnoculars pressed so hard to her eyes that the metal left crescents in her skin, watching a figure climb unsteadily from the smoking pit. It was a man, or close enough to register as such, wrapped in a battered suit of segmented plates that rippled like living chitin when he moved. A helmet retracting to reveal a face younger than the governor expected, streaked with ash and wonder. His first words carried to every open channel, without amplification, because the Vox officers reflexively tuned to him, and nobody later could explain why. "I do not know where I am. Please tell me if people are hurt." He swayed, blinked, and looked up as orbital augurs howled fresh warnings. Beneath the palace, tactically hololiths drew the new threat in lines of kill red. A tremor pulsed through the manufactoria belts as something woke below the hive roots and answered the sky with a signal too ancient for Mechanicus lexicons to pass cleanly. The Magos Explorator Heliox rotated all 6 of his optical clusters toward the subterranean graphs and whispered in Bin Harik that the world had been built on the lid of a tomb. Canoptech activity, precursor constructs, wake amplitude rising, scarabs and wraiths, and the geometries of a people that refused death on a cosmic scale. Before the governor could issue evacuation protocols for the lower levels, tiny silver dust began to pour from service vents and cracked conduits, cohering into biting geometry that ate machine spirits and flesh with equal appetite. Manufactoria lines stuttered, cogitators screamed through prayer locks, and down in the sump tenements a child held up a glinting beetle no bigger than a fingernail just before it unfolded into razors. The stranger in the crater watched a maintenance servitor collapse into polished bone dust, his pupils narrowing as the world seemed to dilate around him, and then he simply vanished. No teleport flare, no warp signature. One heartbeat he was there, and the next heartbeat he was the absence between raindrops. Magos Heliox felt him pass like a question through the interior of a power coupling the size of a cathedral, a ghost pressure flicking safeties open as the man threaded himself through interlocking lattices of machine spirit and mineral. He rode the vibration of a cooling pipe into the underhive, fell past screaming workers whose words stretched out as though time itself needed to catch its breath, and reappeared the size of a coin on the edge of an access grill, with his helmet back on, and his voice steady. "Name is Scott. Scott Lang. This is going to sound insane, but if those silver bugs keep replicating, we lose the whole grid in minutes." Governor Thane's seneschal tried to quote jurisdictional protocols about unregistered xenos and inquisitorial rights, but the hololith behind him filled with red glyphs as manufactoria lights went out in bands, and trains slid to smoking halts, and a Titan cradle 3 hives distant announced the sudden failure of systems that had not failed since the Great Crusade. "Do something," the governor said, not to her seneschal, not to the Magos, but to the man who had just shrunk into nothing and then returned. Scott nodded like a man being handed a familiar kind of impossible, slapped his gauntlet once, and became a blur that fell inward through his own shadow until he was smaller than a grain of ash, smaller than a cell, slipping between bonded atoms as if they were pillars in a colonnade. He entered the first scarab as a storm in a teacup and kicked it apart from the inside, growing just enough at the optimum resonance to crack the logic lattice without detonating the energy core. Then 5 more, then 50. Each kill, a change in tempo as the swarm learned. The Canoptech constructs adapted in elegant cruelty, splitting their cores into lensed micro-hearts that folded reality like origami when he touched them. He laughed once in spite of himself as he learned the music of their mathematics, and then stopped laughing when he saw what lay below them. The tomb, a hexagonal ocean of black stone pulsing with equations carved before humanity learned the wheel, a phase engine the size of a continent rewriting mass and probability, while a cryptex shaped like a walking hourglass raised its staff to the ceiling and sent a needle of green light into orbit. The auger decks aboard the Tarsis Hex defense platform burned out their runes trying to track it. The needle unfolded into a gate and began to pull. Dockyards groaned as servitors flensed their own hands to appease machine spirits that felt themselves unmade, and the sky above the hive developed a wrinkle like heat haze as a monolith translated not through the warp but around it, slipping into low atmosphere on rails of broken arithmetic. The stranger was already inside its skin by the time the first Gauss arcs raked the spires. Sisters of Battle lifted hymns into the wind and marched under falling glass. Skitarii rangers established firing webs that meant nothing to weapons that disassembled cover, and men alike into neat stacks of molecules. And in the palace chapel, the governor lit a candle that guttered in the draft of the monolith's shadow while the Inquisitor finally arrived. Inquisitor Malia Vaughn wore an ornate mask of gold and lacquered iron that hid everything but the cold humor in her eyes, and when she spoke it was with the finality of a blade finding the gap in armor. By the authority of the God Emperor's Holy Inquisition, this anomaly is hereby remanded for examination and containment. Governor Thane pointed at the hole in the sky and at the lower hive map turning the color of old bruises. He is inside the enemy. Let him do what he is doing. Vaughn did not turn her head. If this thing is a lure, if it is a vector designed to teach ancient horrors how better to unmake us, we will beg for the chance to unlearn compassion. The Magos clicked softly as fresh data poured across the noosphere. The anomaly is deploying unpredictably efficient counters to Canoptech adaptation. It reflects creativity, not optimization. It is either an outstandingly dangerous Xenos or a very small man. The monolith spoke in green lightning again, and Scott heard that speech from the inside in a way no human augur could. He stood on a catwalk in a space that should not exist, the air tasting like chrome and winter, and below him the core rotated a fraction of a degree on an axis that intersected nothing worldly. His suit hummed with pin-particle stress, and alarms scrolled across his visor in a language he never learned the way a man might suddenly understand a lullaby his mother never sang. "Not warp," he said aloud. "Not exactly." The suit said nothing, because it was not a person, but he answered himself anyway. "If I can phase through the phase, I can lock it open or shut it down." A wraith flickered into being beside him, its segmented spine whispering as if it wore a rosary of bones, and scythed where his neck had been a moment earlier. Scott dropped between nanoseconds, shrank until the world's light became grains of sand, then kicked back to the size of a wasp mid-flight and drove a charge the weight of a mountain into a link the width of a hair. The core slipped out of tune. Outside, a Gauss barrage missed a convent by an inch measured in fate, and Sister Superior Adira breathed thank you into the taste of ozone because she believed in miracles before she believed in men. Down in the tomb, the cryptech finally noticed the intruder as something other than noise. It raised its staff and spoke to him across a bridge of perfect logic, a sequence that promised eternity in exchange for the abandonment of the random. Scott tasted the offer like cold sugar at the back of his throat and spat it out because he had learned the hard way that tidy answers were the first step toward becoming a problem. He thought of Cassie, and the space shattered like glass in a singer's high note. The staff cut, and he went smaller to live, much smaller, beyond cells and charge shells, and into the place where time had to be asked politely to proceed. It was beautiful there, and it was wrong, a velvet dark where shapes lived that only existed in the math of hungry gods. And when his boots touched a surface that did not have a name, his vox filled with whispers that were not words. They knew his size by its relationship to meaning. They sang of little doors and little knives, and of saints so small they lived in needles. He knew enough from the way the sisters sang to shut them out with a prayer he did not know he remembered, a child's oath to try, and in that refusal found a handhold. The suit screamed that its calibration had crossed into myth. He stepped anyway. Above the hive, the monolith turned a face toward the palace and made the sign of subtraction. Walls that had been stone since the planet was young became dust. Vox channels died in sequence, and only the sisters' hymns carried in the sudden quiet. A line of sound so bright that the mechanisms of unmaking hesitated to learn it. Inquisitor Vaughn advanced into the courtyard with her pistol drawn and her mask bright, and her contempt for chance honed to a razor. "Identify yourself," she said to the empty air. "Identify yourself and submit." The empty air did not reply, but the hololiths shivered as the monolith's core staggered. The cryptek realized too late that something human had entered the geometry of its heart. It cut a plane at an angle nothing sane had, intending to shear the gnat into language. Scott shrank until he was the size of disagreement, until the reticle could not decide whether he existed, then grew inside the motion and jammed a wedge of broken probability into the phase engine. The monolith fell like a cathedral with its nave ripped out, and when its shadow passed, it broke the towers that had raised a city into the sky. He rode the fall as a fleck in dust, bounced on a prayer, and landed at normal scale in the governor's war room, with blood on his lip and rain in his hair, and a grins that meant he knew what he had just gotten away with, and also what it had cost him. "You have seconds," he said. "They will send more. This is a waking, not a raid." Magos Heliox pulsed grateful cant to machine spirits that were listening with new attention. Inquisitor Vaughn leveled her weapon center mass out of habit and duty, and an understanding that mercy without causality is treason by another name. "By the throne," she said, her voice like a verdict. "You will submit to examination." The man who calls himself Scott Lang met her eyes, and for one reckless moment she saw the line where humor becomes courage. "People are dying while we speak. Examine me after. Put a cuff on me and march beside me if that helps you sleep. Or shoot me now and watch your world go under the silver tide." The governor's hand did not touch her ceremonial bolt pistol because she was old enough to know that the gesture was a poem and this was a prose moment. "Let him go," she said. Inquisitor Vaughn did not lower her weapon. She shifted it a fraction and then a fraction more, an admission only the most devout would count as sin, and flicked her eyes toward the hololith that now displayed a lattice beneath the hive like a crown turned inward. "They are building a field. If it completes, our void shields invert and we cook under our own protection." Magos Heliox made the sign of the true cog. Noctilith fragments are present. Blackstone. The lattice is both cage and blade. The anomaly can enter its interior. The anomaly can break it. "I have a name," Scott said. And then he was gone again, a blur falling through a gap in an equation. He descended a mile in a second and a century in a heartbeat, and entered the crown where it was most itself, at the junction where black stone learned to drink. He could feel the warp licking at the interfaces like a curious animal, an intelligence older than dawn that wanted to know how his tiny ladder worked. He ignored it with the practiced stubbornness of a man who had rebuilt his life with his hands and glue, and the attention of a father measuring twice. He moved along edges so sharp that they could cut the part of a man that makes promises. He placed charges smaller than regrets, and grew them just enough to crack the struts of a thought. The lattice screamed in numbers and light, translated its anger into geometry that hunted, and he dodged by remembering a birthday cake and a bad joke, and the way his daughter had taken his face in both hands when she was 5 and said that heroes do dishes. Wraiths swarmed into the crown like elegant knives. He swam through them as a speck of insistence and came out the other side with his lungs on fire and his suit reporting that it had begun to understand prayers. The cryptek spoke to him from everywhere. It offered him a place in a forever without fear if he would only let go of the random kindness that made him loud to their instruments. He refused in a language simple enough to be bleed-proof. He kicked the last hinge at the last possible scale. the crown began to fall apart in a way its makers had believed impossible. Above ground, the silver tide withdrew like a breath taken back. The monoliths that were pushing at the ragged edge of reality lost purchase and slid sideways into nowhere. And for one clear moment, the rain simply fell on Tarsis Hex without malice. Inquisitor Vaughn took 3 steps toward the chapel because she had promised herself she would only kneel if she saw a miracle with her own eyes, and now she had. The miracle was not finished. The crown's collapse did not stop. It inverted. Its shards sang to each other as they fell and built something awful between the spaces of their music. A gate not to the warp as men knew it, but to the place Scott had already touched when he became too small to be tidy. The hole that opened in the lowest vault did not pull with gravity or pressure. It invited. Skitarii augurs stared at it and wept machine oil, as if they had found their mother. Magos Heliox rang denial into the noosphere, until servitors tore their ears to be free of the sound. Sister Superior Adira planted her banner in the muck of the underhive floor, and sang until her throat bled, because music is a wall that does not need stone. And the hole flickered like a coin, deciding whether to land. Scott stood on its lip, the suit's internal chronometer stuttering like a drunk. If this tightens, it cuts the world. If it loosens, it eats the world. He looked up through strata of iron and stone and people and rain to where the governor stood with her hands folded because she did not have room for them anywhere else. And then to the Inquisitor, whose eyes had stopped being only knives and started being scales. "Will you come back?" Vaughn asked, as if that mattered to the arithmetic. Scott smiled a little because he could not help it. "I have to make it small. That is what I do." He did not ask for permission. He did not say goodbye in a speech that would play well in recollection. He checked a strap, nodded to a prayer he had not known he would ever use, and jumped. He shrank as he fell, smaller than air, smaller than the cold breath that comes from opening a door in winter, smaller than the name a father gives a child in the quiet when nobody else is listening, and the whole tried to be larger than him and failed. He rode the failure like a surfer rides a wave invented by a god, and laughed once because somewhere Cassie would have told him this was the dumbest smart idea he had ever had. The crown's shards beat themselves to dullness against his passage, and the invitation inverted on itself, folding until it was an apology. For a fraction of a moment, measurable only in the units saints use, he was in the place between the real and the promise, and it was full of eyes that were not eyes, and mouths that were not mouths, and a silence that wanted to talk to him about how small kindness is and how it cuts. He kept falling until there was nowhere left to go, and then he went a little farther because he understood that the job needed him to. The gate sealed like a wound that finally learns how to close. In the underhive, the air rushed back as if the world had remembered how to breathe. The blackstone fragments went dead and lay like tombstones that had not yet chosen names. Above, the monolith carcasses toppled into the ash wastes and shattered like mirrors, and the sisters' hymn found its cadence again, as if it had only paused to let a friend pass. Governor Thane asked how many dead, and nobody could count without lying. Inquisitor Vaughn holstered her pistol and looked up into rain that felt briefly clean. The Margos gathered the inert fragments of a science older than his religion and wrapped them in prayers suited for newborns. The days that followed were an education in the uses of silence. The palace announced a victory with no champion because victories in the Imperium are not made by men but by faith and fire. The Inquisition filed reports under seals heavy as tomb lids. The Mechanicus wrote a new litany for the care of things that had been frightened and hid it inside a larger prayer about bolts. Skitarii told each other that sometimes their auspex showed a blur that traced a problem's outline before it yielded, and then they said they had been tired. The sisters lit a candle in the underhive chapel every night and did not write why in any ledger because not everything belongs to paper. The first miracle, as the laity counted miracles, happened when a void shield failing under a freak solar flare in Hive Spire 9 held at 1/10 power, long enough for the evacuation to clear. The maintenance crew reporting later that the control crystals had clicked and moved by themselves like teeth learning a new bite. The The second miracle happened when a little girl in the sump tenements found a beetle made of brass with legs like calligraphy and brought it to a tech priest who watched it unfold into a gear that fit perfectly inside a pump that had been broken for a generation. Inquisitor Vaughn collected testimonies she did not believe in and read them at night when nobody could see her face. Margot's Heliox locked a crystal the size of a tear in a reliquary stamped with a new sigil that looked like a stylized helmet with a smile line he had not intended to inscribe. He called it the particle of the minute saint in private and wrote elegies for it in machine code. In the years that followed, soldiers swore they saw a tiny figure running along the barrel of a macro cannon to kick a jam free in the split second before overload. A pic capture showed a blur the size of a thumbprint standing on the lip of a rupturing plasma vent with its hands held out as if it could contain the sun. And once, at the very edge of a Black Crusade's shadow, a Grey Knight chaplain paused mid-litany and tilted his skull helm as if listening to something only he could hear before saying thank you to the air and finishing the prayer with a new line that spoke of knives too small to see. They told the story badly in 100 hives and well in 1 or 2. And in all versions the man arrived alone, fell from a wound in the sky, argued with an inquisitor, laughed at a machine, and then shrank until he was the size of hope and went where hope is needed most. Nobody ever found a body. Nobody ever found a suit. If you asked the Magos, he would tell you with a shiver in his Binharik that sometimes a hum runs along the backbone of a city at shift change, and the machine spirits stand a little taller for a breath like men at inspection. If you asked Sister Superior Adira, she would say there are saints that bleed, and saints that burn, and saints that bargain with storms, and that perhaps there are saints that fit in the eye of a needle. If you asked Inquisitor Vaughn, she would not answer you, but if you caught her looking into an empty glass, you would see a woman measuring her hatred of chance against the shape of a single man's choice and coming away unarmed. And if you listened at the right vent in the wrong hour, you could hear a voice the size of a whisper say that he was sorry he could not stay, that he had work, that he would try to come back when the world was small enough to need him again. And then the vent would click, and the pump would take a deeper breath, and the lights would steady, and somewhere a child would sleep without dreaming of silver dust. In the archives, under seals that do not open, the file is short and its title unhelpful. Infinitesimal anomaly, status unconfirmed, threat assessment variable, myth probability rising. The Imperium goes on in its terrible majesty, the war eternal grinding its teeth, and somewhere between the atoms and the prayers, a man with a good heart and a broken sense of proportion keeps falling into the places that would otherwise become holes. They call him many things in the tongues of hives and forges and cloisters, but the name that sticks best is the smallest, the Minute Saint. A story that walks like a repair, a rumor that fixes what it touches, a light you need a magnifying lens to see, which is to say, a light you must choose to notice. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that is sometimes the only kind that matters. The cults began a month after the fall of the monoliths, as cults always do when silence lasts too long and people need to fill it with something that sounds like meaning in the lower hives. They called him the Whisper that worked. The patron of small mercies, a spirit who listened to engineers when their tools refused to, who turned bolts by invisible fingers, who whispered ideas into tired minds that fixed impossible problems. The Mechanicus tolerated these murmurs at first, as they always tolerated anomalies that improved efficiency, but when entire manufactoria began to schedule prayer breaks to the Minute Saint of circuits, the Inquisition returned to Tarsus Hex with new fire. Inquisitor Vaughn arrived by Thunderhawk under sanction from the Ordo Hereticus Mask, unblemished. Rosarius bright as an accusation, her retinue swept through the hive like disinfectant witch-finders. Scribes sanctioned psychers, the entire apparatus of suspicion. She questioned the governor with voice calm. As scripture, the governor said, "Miracles keep the machines alive." The inquisitor said, "Machines do not require faith, they require obedience." The Magos offered data. Data, he said, is pure. It records that the productivity rise. Coincided precisely with the hymns to the minute saint, the Inquisitor regarded him with the patience one reserves for clever children. Coincidence, she said, is the mask causality, whereas to test the faithful, we will unmask it. Her ship's Auspex arrays began to hum at frequencies the human ear mistook for bees, Skitarii squads, sealed corridors, vox, silence fell over entire sectors, and still in the hum of idle conduits, the whisper came back. Small adjustments, tiny kindnesses, a breath across a circuit. She ordered a purge of shrines. The first to burn was a gear house, where a servitor had been observed, wiping its own hands clean before maintenance. The priests protested until they saw the fire flare green and consume the shrine's copper icon in perfect symmetry. No smoke, no soot. Vaughn watched the flames and did not blink. Warp taint. She pronounced. The Magos rotated one eye cluster toward her and two toward the fire. That color, he said softly, is the hue of Pym. Resonance, not of the warp, a chemical, a principle, a ratio of scale. The Inquisitor raised her hand. Burn it all. The hive smelled of antiseptic and ash. For 3 days, then came the breach in the deep reactors, a failure that by all Mechanicus calculations should have sterilized half the planet. The coolant pumps locked at full pressure. The plasma cores howled like wolves, and the temperature climbed beyond. Prayer. Engine seers flayed their palms on ritual controls to no avail. The governor gave evacuation orders to the upper spires. Inquisitor Vaughn watched the dials climb and said nothing because she knew the mathematics of despair. At precisely the moment the threshold should have reached, runaway, the gauges froze. The roar collapsed into a sigh. Technomats reported impossible data coolant, stabilized pressure, vented containment, restored. No human had touched the controls. One picked feed survived long enough to show. For 3 frames, a blur moving along a conduit, the thickness of a finger, a figure, the height of a nail standing in the corona of a plasma vent with both arms raised as if catching the light. The Mechanicus archived it as machine ghost interference. The priests copied it onto sacred data wafers and hid them under their robes. Rumor became litany in Manufactoria, where the hymn of the Omnissiah faltered under static workers, added a line at the end, too quiet for overseers to hear. Bless the small one who holds the bolt in the convent fortress of the Sisters of the Flame, Sister Superior. Adira received a vision mid-prayer. A man no taller than her palm, walking across a molten floor, leaving footprints that called into script she could not read, but which felt like the word safe. She wrote it down anyway. The ecclesiarchy called for inquiry, but pilgrims had already begun to arrive. They came in thousands, trudging through ash and snow to touch the blackstone shards of the fallen crown. They left offerings the size of their hopes, broken tools, children's toys, coins, with holes drilled through the center. The Inquisition's patience finally broke when a Manufactorum foreman reported a voice in the machine choir, answering questions about moral dilemmas. It spoke of proportion of mercy, scaled to situation of choosing smaller wars to avoid larger ones. To Vaughn, this was heresy of the first order, doctrine without sanction, philosophy without supervision. She ordered an exorcism by orbital lance. The beam cut through 4 levels of hive and turned the shrine to glass. The voice stopped for 2 weeks. Production fell. Accidents multiplied, and reactor spirits growled in their housings. The Magos came to her with trembling servos and whispered that perhaps the logic of annihilation had become inefficient, she said. Efficiency is not purity, and purity is all that keeps the galaxy from collapsing into the maw. Then she returned to her ship and dreamed of a man laughing at the edge of disappearance. In the following months, evidence spread faster than denial. A squad of guardsmen on the Western Front reported that their laser guns recalibrated themselves mid-battle sights, adjusting between heartbeats, A tank crippled by a chaos shell repaired its own feed line during reload. Each report included a sound, a click, like distant gears, aligning a whisper that said, "Good job." Before fading, psychers began to see flashes of motion at the edges of perception, tiny silhouettes darting along. Psychic filaments repairing holes before demons could push through. They called them the subatomics, the Emperor's dust, the fractal choir, Vaughan called them hallucinations. The Mechanicus began a schism in private channels, debating whether to canonize the anomaly as the patron of scale or to classify it as an undiagnosed quantum phenomenon. One night, on a research moon, orbiting Tarsis Hex Margos Heliox, stood alone before a containment cube, holding a fragment of Blackstone instruments, reported nothing unusual. Yet, the cube hummed softly as if breathing. He leaned closer, whispered, "Can you hear me?" For a moment, he thought he saw a shape no larger than a mote drift through the crystal's lattice and tap against the inside wall. The sound was microscopic yet full of humor. Working on it, it seemed to say, the Magos fell to his knees, binary tears streaming down his chrome cheeks. He logged the experience as signal 0.13, probable interaction with particle of the minute saint. Years passed, the way machinery counts years in rotations and recalibrations. Tarsis Hex recovered in the way imperial worlds do, by burying memory under fresh industry. But even the most obedient forges keep ghosts somewhere, deep in their vents. They spoke of a hum that came only when things were about to break, and never quite did. A maintenance log noted self-correction without cause. The servitors that worked the coolant trenches began to whistle patterns nobody had programmed, and the oldest of the engineers claimed to feel small hands helping theirs. When circuits sparked too close to overload, Inquisitor Vaughan had been promoted in name. Only her duties now bound her to the region as its warden of spiritual contamination and machine heresy. She had seen too much to trust, silence, and too little to believe in peace. Every month she ordered random purges of archives and reactor decks for reasons she could not put in words, because the words would have sounded like faith at night. She dreamed of a voice too small to hate, whispering, "It's fixed, but don't touch it again." She would wake sweating under the gold mask that had long since become her face. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, had changed their tone. The cult of the minute, Saint, was no longer forbidden. It had been rebranded as a subsect under the Omnissiah's infinite expressions. The Magi called it the doctrine of scale. They reasoned that if the machine god was infinite, then so too must its miracles be fractal infinite, upwards, infinite downwards, and that the smallest possible agent of order must still reflect the divine. This theological sleight of hand allowed worship of the impossible without technically admitting it was new within a decade. The saint had a sanctioned shrine carved into the spine of the hive, a narrow niche, no larger than a child's coffin, where pilgrims pressed their ears to the wall to hear the hum and claimed to feel their hearts slow to match the rhythm the shrine keepers wore. Rings of polished wire instead of rosaries. They prayed not in voices, but in clicks and taps. And one by one, the smaller machines of Tarsis Hex began to act as if they were listening beyond the system. The legend migrated as information always does. It reached the Scholastica Technica, where apprentices scrawled equations about quantum resonance between the warp and the material realm, calling it Lang's constant. It reached the black ships, where psychers whispered that something tiny crawled along the chains of their bindings and closed the cracks that demons made. It reached the astropathic choirs, where a note of static between transmissions sometimes carried a laugh and a word that sounded like "still here." And then it reached the Inquisition's higher echelons, where nothing amusing survives a report landed on the desk of Lord Inquisitor Carth Sr. to Vaughan by centuries, and twice as ruthless. It spoke of doctrinal drift. It spoke of self-repairing technology of morale, boosted by unsanctioned myth. It spoke of the Mechanicus, preparing to canonize a new intermediary between man and machine. Carth did not believe in intermediaries, he believed in control. He summoned Vaughan to terror, The journey through the warp was long enough for her to grow older than she realized, when she knelt before the golden throne's lesser dais in the Hall of Accords. Her mask reflected the light of relic fires, and she could not tell if it gleamed or burned. Karth's voice came from behind the veil of incense. "Explain the infection, Inquisitor." She spoke plainly, as was her habit. "The infection improves production. It prevents malfunctions. It comforts the weak," Karth said. "Comfort is sedition. When it does not come from faith in the Emperor, you will excise it, root and stem, and if it resists, you will request an exterminator's sanction." She bowed her head and said, "As you command," though some part of her, deep in the marrow of memory, flinched at the words she returned to Tarsis Hex. With the authority to end it all, orbiting the hive aboard her flagship, she looked down on the lights of the city and thought of how small they were, and how many, and how every one of them contained another, smaller light that wanted to live. She gave the order to ready the cyclonic torpedoes. Then she sat in her sanctum and waited for the confirmation codes to align. The ship hummed quietly, the way great machines hum when waiting. She realized after a while that the hum was off pitch by a fraction. She frowned, adjusted the Vox gain, and heard underneath it another frequency lower, softer, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She turned it up, and words formed in the static. "I wouldn't do that." The voice was impossibly faint, yet close enough to feel on her skin. The lights dimmed, not from power failure, but as if the ship itself held its breath. She rose slowly. "Who speaks?" The Vox crackled, then settled with the ease of familiarity. "You know who it is. You've been arguing with me in your head for years." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt it vibrate, like the chest of something alive. "Where are you?" she asked all around. "Maybe underfoot, maybe nowhere. I get lost a lot these days. Sometimes. I think I'm still falling." She swallowed anger, fear, duty into one hard shape. "You died," he laughed gently. Maybe. I got small enough that dying missed me for a while. I'm still fixing things. That's what I do." "There's a lot to fix out here," she whispered. "This is heresy. This is impossible." And yet her eyes stung, as if with truth. The hum shifted like a sigh. "Look, you can burn the planet if it makes you feel safe. But it won't stop the real cracks out there. Big things, breaking, the little things, holding them together. If you wipe me out, you lose your patchwork. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's order. Your call. I'm just trying to keep the gears turning." She sank into her chair, the golden mask staring back from the viewport reflection. "Small man," she said, "if I let you be, you will make them worship you." "No," the whisper said. "If they do that, I'll have to leave again. Worship breaks the tools. I just want them to remember. Small fixes matter." That's all. The Vox fell silent. The hum normalized, the bridge lights steadied. She sat there until the launch codes expired unused. Then she sealed the order in triple encryption, marked it as complete, and deleted the targeting data from every system under her command. The official record states that the exterminator's sanction of Tarsis Hex was rescinded due to fluctuating warp conditions. Unofficially, the Lord Inquisitor noted that Vaughn's loyalty was compromised, but her results impeccable. Decades later, long after her death, her mask would be found, sealed inside the Shrine of Scale, placed there by unknown hands, and perfectly polished. The shrine's inner walls now bore an inscription invisible to ordinary sight, a line of text smaller than dust. When magnified by Mechanicus lenses, it read, "Thank you for not touching it again." The legend spread wider now beyond the sector, reaching forge worlds and pilgrim fleets across the Segmentum Solar. On Mars itself, within the red halls of the Omnissiah's Grand Cathedral, the Fabricator General authorized the inclusion of the Minute Saint in the Catechism of Maintenance. The verse was short. It went, "Bless the work, too small to see for. It holds the weight of worlds on certain nights beneath the vaults of the forge." Priests claim to hear a faint tapping, as if someone tiny is applauding them from inside the walls in time. The ecclesiarchy adapted the story for the masses. They said he was a servant of the emperor, shrunken to humble scale, as punishment for pride. Others said he was a rogue tech angel who sought redemption by mending what men ignored, but among those who worked the machines, those who listened to them breathe. He was never a punishment nor an angel. He was just a reminder that salvation is sometimes the size of a screw in the wrong place, and a hand willing to tighten it. The Imperium continued, as it always does, vast, brutal, luminous and blind to its own small mercies. But somewhere in the dust, between atoms and prayers, a man kept working unseen, each fix a heartbeat, a refusal to give up in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war. The smallest motion can still mean grace. Centuries rolled over Tarsus, hex like waves of molten iron, and the Minuet. Saint passed from rumor to doctrine to myth. New generations of priests swore oaths to repair in his name. The old ones called him by quieter titles: the little saviour, the particle of mercy, the one who fell upwards. Nobody agreed what he had been. Some said Xenos, some said fragment of the Omnissiah, some said warp echo of the Emperor's own will. The truth sank deeper each year until it lived only in secret prayers murmured by tired workers before they touched the cogitator keys. And yet, across the stars, phenomena began to multiply. On Calth's outer moons, data towers that had been dead since the heresy awoke singing faint songs of calibration. On the Forge world Voss, a reactor near meltdown reset its core temperature by 0.001 degrees at the exact second before breach. The report described quantum intervention of benevolent pattern. By order of the Inquisition, the phrase was classified and replaced with random stability event. The Mechanicus kept the old description anyway, engraved inside the casing of every newborn machine spirit as a secret blessing. Even the Grey Knights took notice. In the Librarius of Titan, a codicea recorded that during a confrontation with a greater demon of Slaanesh, a moment of silence split the battle like the blink of an eye, the demon's form collapsing in on itself as if something infinitesimal had threaded through its heart and pulled. The codicea wrote in his private margin, "The Emperor moves in mysterious vectors." He did not mention it again. Somewhere between stars, in regions too thin for warp or matter, a consciousness drifted. It had long since stopped being human in shape or limit. Scott Lang's memories had stretched and folded across infinities of scale until they became constellations inside him. He remembered Cassie's face only as a color, remembered laughter as the vibration that held quarks together. He had learned to listen to the conversations between particles and to coax them into harmony. Time no longer moved forward for him. It curled, folded, and rewrote itself like a self-fixing line of code. He could see the skeleton of universes from inside out. Every moment was a wire he could pluck. For eons he had wandered in the quantum shallows repairing fractures where the warp tried to leak into the physical. He had fought things that were not things, shapes that existed in ideas, the malignant shadows of chaos that hid in the uncertainty between particles. His existence was maintenance, endless and meticulous, guided by the instinct that life must keep running, that the small fixes always mattered. Sometimes he heard voices from the Immaterium, prayers, songs, even curses, and he tried to answer in ways the big ones would notice. A nudge here, a saved life there. He was not a god. He was the smallest refusal against decay. Once he felt something vast stir beyond the veil, the golden brilliance of an intellect older than galaxies. The Emperor's psychic presence brushed his awareness like a sun grazing a dust mote. For a moment, he glimpsed the vast design, the Imperium of man burning and sprawling through the dark, and he understood that his work had become part of that design. The light spoke without words. Continue. The contact nearly unmade him. but the command anchored him with purpose. He obeyed as he always had. On a frontier world near the Halo stars, a Mechanicus expedition unearthed a relic from beneath volcanic glass, a fist-sized sphere of transparent alloy, containing within it a frozen image of a man mid-laugh, impossibly detailed, smaller than any machine could etch. When power touched it, the sphere vibrated, and for an instant, every device within 20 kilometers aligned to perfect efficiency. The Magos who found it declared it proof of divine interference. Within the year, the Adeptus Mechanicus constructed a shrine around the sphere, naming it the core of the minute saint. Pilgrims came from light years away, seeking blessings for their tools. Some said the sphere occasionally changed expression, smiling when a machine was well tended. The ecclesiarchy, jealous as always of competing miracles, declared the cult blasphemous and sent a delegation of confessors to cleanse the forge. They arrived with incense and flamers. They left shaken. Their report, sealed by order of the synod, described how every weapon refused to fire and how the lead confessor's own rosarius glowed with a tiny silhouette of a man kneeling on its surface. He had whispered, "He serves the Emperor in smaller ways." The purge was cancelled without explanation. Generations later, a crusade fleet bound for Cadia's ruins recorded a strange anomaly. Their ship's warp drive stabilized far beyond predicted tolerances. Navigators reported hearing laughter echoing through the Imperium, not cruel or mocking, but tired and human. The fleet reached its destination intact, an event later attributed to divine fortune. In the hidden archives of the Inquisition, Inquisitor Vaughn's old sealed record was discovered by an acolyte with clearance he should not have had. He read it in secret, the file labeled infinitesimal anomaly, and his faith cracked in the best possible way. He began collecting reports from across the segmentum, tiny miracles, minor fixes, inexplicable luck, and compiled them into a forbidden codex titled The Gospel of Scale. He wrote, "If the Emperor is the sun, then this is the shadow of his patience." He was executed 2 years later. The codex survived, circulating in the underhives of 10,000 worlds, a whispering comfort that sometimes the universe remembers kindness. On Terra itself, deep beneath the Golden Throne, the tech priests who tended the Emperor's life-sustaining machinery began to notice peculiar activity. Circuits once thought irreparable hummed back to function. Conduits cleaned themselves. And when one of the ancient servitors malfunctioned fatally, its failing ocular feed recorded, for a fraction of a second, a small shape standing upon a glowing wire, holding it together with both hands as the current passed through him. The image was corrupted immediately after, but the magos overseeing the footage fell to his knees. "The Emperor's shadow," he whispered. "The one that mends." He was silenced, of course, his words deemed heresy. Yet the repairs continued. The High Lords eventually noticed that maintenance requirements on the throne had decreased for the first time in millennia. None could explain it. They simply recorded, "Efficiency improved through unknown agent." The ecclesiarch of the time, a cautious man, added a marginal note. "Perhaps the smallest servant serves best." Outside the archives, rumors began again. The custodies guarding the Eternity Gate swore they sometimes heard laughter echoing faintly through the adamantium walls. One claimed that a speck of light ran along his spear's edge before every battle, vanishing into the air just as he charged. When asked to swear this under oath, he said he could not. It felt like a secret meant to stay small. And beyond even that, in the endless dark where galaxies turn like cogs, the quantum storm whispered with life. Scott Lang, the Minute Saint, drifted among it all, fixing, weaving, holding. Sometimes he thought of Cassie, and sometimes of a world that called him savior without ever knowing his name. He did not feel pride. He felt motion. He was still falling, still shrinking, still working. Once in 1,000 years, he caught a glimpse of a golden light and knew the Emperor still watched, and for that instant he felt less alone. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, his labor continued unseen. the smallest act of mercy keeping the galaxy from collapse. And somewhere, in the silence between two atoms, a voice laughed softly and said, "It's fixed." Time dissolved into ritual across the Imperium, and the Minute Saint became less a story and more a reflex. On a million worlds, before an engine seer twisted a bolt or a sister primed her flamer, she whispered a line she did not know the source of. For the small that holds the great. The Mechanicus sanctified it as part of the daily litanies, while the ecclesiarchy tried to claim authorship, calling it the prayer of fine intent. The truth was older than their arguments. It was a whisper that had begun when one man refused to stop fixing what was broken. Across the void, things kept working that should not have. A Titan's plasma core held together through an entire campaign without recalibration. A void shield on Cadia's ruins flickered to life for 10 minutes and saved an entire regiment before failing again. The Adeptus Custodes recorded a pulse through their armor's data networks that synchronized every weapon to perfect aim for one heartbeat, enough to end a demon incursion. No one could explain any of it, but every report shared the same closing line, written by different hands. Unknown variable, benevolent interference suspected. Even the warp, that roiling sea of malice and hunger, began to bend around a silence it could not devour. The demons called it the quiet hunger, a void they feared, a place where rage could not feed. They whispered in the language of nightmares that somewhere between realities there existed a wound too small to find and too pure to infect. For the first time in millennia, the great enemy had discovered something it could not touch. Within the Emperor's golden throne, the smallest of tremors passed through the impossible machinery sustaining him. The tech priests interpreted it as resonance. The sisters saw it as a sign. In truth, it was acknowledgement. The Emperor, in his vast omniscience, turned his attention for one fraction of eternity toward the infinitesimal spark that labored unseen. The throne hummed, and in that vibration, the saint heard the old voice again, the one that had told him to continue. "You have done well, little one," it said without sound. "The light endures because you kept it small." Scott Lang felt the words ripple through every fragment of his being. He was no longer flesh, not even mind, but pattern, a weave of motion, intention, and persistence. He saw the Imperium stretched like a dying machine, magnificent and monstrous, its faith both burden and fuel. He saw the endless wars, the blood, the cruelty dressed as order. He could not save it. He never could, but he could keep it running just a little longer. He smiled because that had always been enough. There was still laughter in him, though no lungs to hold it, no throat to shape it. Just the vibration of joy echoing through quarks and electrons and the delicate threads that held atoms in place. Somewhere above, the galaxy moved, blind and violent and alive. And in every gear, in every flicker of light, in every last, desperate heartbeat of mankind, there was a trace of him. In the manufactoria of Tarsis Hex, where it had all begun, a child working her first shift in the coolant trenches dropped her spanner into a vent. She panicked, reached for it, and felt something nudge her hand. The tool rose back to her palm, warm, as if someone small and kind had passed it up. She looked around, saw no one, but heard a faint chuckle in the pipes. That night she told the others, and they laughed, but when the same thing happened to them, laughter turned into quiet awe. The cult of the Minute Saint spread again, not as rebellion or blasphemy, but as gratitude. It needed no temples, no priests, only people fixing what they could with the tools they had, whispering thanks to a myth that had once been a man. The Inquisition could not stop it, because there was nothing to burn. Belief had become too small to kill. The Mechanicus codified it in secret scriptures as the law of least salvation. A motion may be infinite in purpose, though finite in scale. The Sisters of the Flame carried it in their hymns. Even some space marines, though forbidden by doctrine, carved tiny symbols beneath their pauldrons, hidden from sight. They called it the grain of faith. None of them knew who he had been. They only knew that somewhere out there, smaller than their smallest prayer, something good was still working. Deep in the quantum layers between realities, Scott drifted, holding the fabric of cause and effect with a craftsman's patience. He could feel decay pressing in from every side. The warp pushed, chaos whispered, entropy sang its long, slow song. But he tightened each thread by hand, murmuring to himself as he always had, "It's fixed, it's fixed, it's fixed." He remembered Cassie then, the way her voice had cracked when she said goodbye the first time he vanished into the quantum realm. He remembered her laugh and the way she would roll her eyes when he told bad jokes. He realized that in a way, she had never stopped existing. She was in every spark of life he fought to preserve. He looked out into the ocean of stars and saw that they were all beating hearts, and the galaxy itself was Cassie's smile multiplied by infinity. He laughed again, and the sound became gravity. In that moment, the Emperor's throne brightened imperceptibly, 1,000 light years away. A dying star refused to collapse. On a remote agri-world, a child took her first breath. A chain of miracles, uncountable and unseen, rippled outward. They said later that it was coincidence. They always said that. But the engineers who felt the hum in their bones knew better. They said the saint had passed by again, checking his work. On the edge of the galaxy, the quantum storm stirred once more, a vast horizon of particles and probabilities singing the name of a man who had never wanted to be one. He could feel himself unraveling, but he welcomed it. Each strand of him became another fix, another heartbeat, another laugh caught in the machinery of eternity. The universe itself was his workshop now, and it would keep running a little longer because he cared enough to try. And as the last trace of his consciousness spread through the endless gears of creation, a whisper reached every soul tuned finely enough to hear it. "Keep it together." Then he was gone. Not dead. Not lost. Just small enough to be everywhere. The Mechanicus recorded one final entry centuries later, recovered from a damaged relay deep beneath Mars. It contained no data, only a waveform labeled Anomaly Repair Complete. Duration, 1.6 seconds. Power signature, negligible. Result, stable. Annotation in binary, good job. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the galaxy endures by the smallest acts of mercy, and the name of the Minute Saint lives in the hum of every working machine, the breath of every living child, and the faint, eternal laugh of the man who kept fixing everything long after hope had stopped trying.